Part 10. Adventurer of the Elf World. Author, Wu Nangkuang Song. Chapter 91. It's not easy to be a trainer. If you really want your elf to be obedient, it's not that simple. Just collecting the elf ball doesn't mean it's completely obedient. Different elves have different personalities, and the elf ball functions only as a residence. In the animation, there may be situations where people are obedient after being caught, but it is definitely not common. This situation is possible only for people with an incredible affinity. Once someone's aura of friendship is revealed, it's not uncommon for mythical beasts to pay their respects. As for ordinary people, it's better to go to sleep, there is everything in their dreams. Even the game has a saying about what badges you need to get to command levels below, although this is to allow players to advance the main plot. The bond between an elf and a trainer is emotional, which requires time and energy to cultivate. The daily communication and contact between elves and trainers is the most important. Shiu like this will naturally attract the attention of the elves. You must know that compared to humans, they are much more sensitive to some situations. You must know that no matter how tired you are, you will look like everything is under control instead of frowning and staring blankly now. Why didn't Shiu know the reactions of the elves? It's just that Kathy and Flying Mantis come in after eating. I have something to tell you. After saying that, he walked into the warehouse alone. Looking at Shiu's leaving figure, Casey and Flying Mantis looked at each other, and then followed him. As for the remaining rations, they would deal with them later. Listening to the movement behind him, Shiu turned around, looked at the two of them and said, "Come here, I have something to say." Shiu sat on the ground not far from the door. When the two of them came over, he looked up at them, but when the words came to his lips, he couldn't say anything. In the end, he could only sigh. Alas, Shiu lowered his head and murmured, "Forget it, it's all fate." Of course, the two of them couldn't understand Shiu's nonsense, but Casey seemed to be prepared. Feeling the telepathy transmitted by Casey, Shiu just hesitated for a moment and took it, but the first sentence surprised him. "Is it about me?" Flying Mantis thoughts came through. "Is my performance so obvious? You can actually see it?" Shiu had a forced smile on his face, but seeing the expressionless looks on their faces, he felt that the atmosphere was a bit awkward and he could only put on a serious face and said, "Yes, your report has come out." Casey's side is still the same, but Flying Mantis, you have made a new discovery. Now that he had opened his mouth, Shiu didn't intend to drag it out anymore. He just told everything without any concealment, from the ancient people's research on the Flying Mantis to its current situation, including the fact that DROE wanted to use it as a research object. It was already so big, there was no use in fooling it anymore, and Shiu felt that he might not be able to fool it. What's more important is that a lie needs to be covered up with more lies. This is too tiring. It is better to say it clearly directly, which is better for everyone. It was indeed my fault that I deceived you out of the park out of selfish motives. Now that I have found out the reason why this happened to you, then. The confession like chanting sutras suddenly stopped. Now I think about what was the agreement with it? Protect. Wrong. Is it getting stronger? It doesn't seem right either. What is it? Just when Shiu was thinking wildly, Flying Mantis suddenly said something. What do you think? Huh, Xiaoyi called out, as if what he just said was his own hallucination. I want to hear your opinion. The meaning of the Flying Mantis came again. Now Shiu knew that what just happened was not an illusion, but he fell into thinking again. What does Flying Mantis mean? What do you mean you want to hear my opinion? What part does he want to hear opinions on? Are you talking about the ability of metal affinity or the difference between the Flying Mantis and the giant pincer mantis? Shiu asked tentatively, and continued when he saw that the Flying Mantis showed no reaction. Actually, I also think that the giant pincer mantis is just another form of the flying mantis, and your situation is more like a talent to become a giant pincer mantis. It does not require evolution materials like other flying mantises. Just touch the metal. Do you think I should continue? It should be, or it might be the same as the world's first giant pincer mantis. It should have suffered similar experiences to you, but it was finally born. Those who followed were just its imitators and did not have the talent like you. A crude imitator. What's more important is that you can't live your whole life without contact with metal products. Even in the wild, there are metal ores. I prefer to develop it rather than waste this talent. The giant pincer mantis is no worse than the flying mantis. I see. Shiu looked at the flying mantis, waiting for its next answer, but it didn't seem to have the intention to continue, it just stood there not knowing what it was thinking. Looking at the flying mantis, Shiu remembered that he was so small when he first met it, and now it has grown so big. Speaking of which, the elf's development is really fast. It only took a month or two for the baby elf to be over-completed, and now I can no longer hold it. Of course, this has something to do with the fact that the flying mantis is an insect-type elf. Generally, people like Casey don't react at all. After a month or two, they don't even gain weight at all. If you don't just watch it eat, you will think that it will eat it with its backhand. The rations were down. I can't figure it out, maybe this is related to the rapid consumption of its body. What do you think? If you don't want to evolve into a giant pincer mantis, just wait until these things in your body are metabolized and you will be like an ordinary flying mantis. As long as you have less contact with metal products in the future, it shouldn't be a big problem. Shiu also broke the jar and started talking casually. I decided to evolve into a giant pincer mantis. Shiu was stunned for a moment when he heard this, and then said after 2 or 3 seconds, "Are you sure? You weren't before." Shiu didn't say anything anymore, because the flying mantis had already made its choice. I want to become stronger. This path may be prepared for me. Like you said, I shouldn't waste this talent. The flying mantis is thirsty for power. And after seeing the outside world, it has no idea about the park. Maybe like Casey, leaving is the best choice. Or maybe I have found a place to stay. That's it. Shiu seemed to feel the meaning of flying mantis, rubbing his chin with one hand and supporting his arm with the other. Then do you still want to agree to Daramu? Adventurer of the Elf World. Author, Wu Nangkuang Song. Chapter 92. Now that he knows the principle, he can make Scyther evolve even without Professor Oak, but he is slightly different from Professor Oak who has studied this. No, it is a big difference. But if he agrees, Shiu doesn't know what Professor Oak is going to do. Although he said there would be no danger, there is no such thing as an absolutely safe experiment. Moreover, with Professor Oak's ability, he would not know even if he did something tricky. Since Scyther is willing to trust him, he naturally can't agree to it casually. Although Professor Oak looks okay, you can't tell what he thinks. I will negotiate with Professor Oak about this. Don't worry, I won't let you get into trouble. Shiu can only put the sentence aside for now. There are many things in it that cannot be said in one sentence. He needs to negotiate with Professor Oak. As for now. Shiu turned his head and looked at Casey. "Doctor, it's time for breakfast," Shiu shouted to the second floor from the stairs. Although it was already past 8 o'clock, Shiu still felt it was easier to talk about things at the dinner table. At this time, the relationship between people would be relaxed, and at least there would be no embarrassment if there was something to eat. More importantly, he hadn't had breakfast yet. A few minutes later, the doctor came down from the second floor and saw the breakfast prepared by Shiu and smiled. "I haven't had breakfast for a while." Shiu saw that Dr. Oak didn't mention the matter of Scyther, so he didn't mention it either, but smiled and said, "The doctor will have breakfast every day in the future." But after sitting down, Dr. Oak didn't eat, but looked at Chiu with a meaningful smile on his face. "What experiment is the doctor going to prepare?" Chiu asked, poking his breakfast. "Have you decided? I need more detailed information. Didn't I say that we should gradually increase the metal content in its body, and then keep records and observe the changes in its body? There will be no danger." "Is that so?" Chiu fiddled with the breakfast in the bowl and didn't answer for a long time. Dr. Oak is still a doctor after all. Seeing Chiu like this, he knew what he was still worried about. Now he only cares about one problem. That is how metal will affect Scyther. "Don't worry, metal has no negative impact on Scyther. The body structure of the elf is different from that of humans. Don't limit it with human perspectives. And as far as I know, the lifespan of Scyther is similar to that of the giant claw mantis. There is not much difference." Chiu nodded, then looked at Professor Oak and said, "I think it's okay, I'm just afraid that Scyther will resist during the experiment." "I understand this, even if it doesn't agree, it doesn't matter, anyway, as long as we find the direction, we can prove it." At this time, Professor Oak gave an answer that surprised Chiu. "What do you mean you can prove it without Scyther?" Chiu felt that Dr. Oak must be very clear about his doubts, but he didn't seem to want to explain. Chiu was not sure what Dr. Oak meant, and didn't dare to ask more, and dealt with the breakfast in front of him. After breakfast, Dr. Oak didn't mean to leave, but looked at Chiu with a smile on his face. Chiu often uses this expression because it can give people a very stable feeling. But now that it is used on himself, he feels a little pressure. "Doctor, it's not difficult to get Scyther to participate in the experiment, but I have a request." "Go ahead." Dr. Oak looked easygoing, as if he had known what he was going to say. "I need the doctor to help Casey's research, and I want to participate in the doctor's research on the two of them throughout the process. The doctor cannot hide anything from me during the period, and I have the right to terminate it all." "Haha, okay, it doesn't matter, Casey's matter was originally arranged." Dr. Oak suddenly laughed, and agreed to Chiu's request very easily, and he looked like he was not surprised at all. "Okay, I'll tell Scyther about this later, and I'll solve it over there." Chiu saw that the doctor agreed to this request so easily, and for a moment he didn't know whether he was happy or surprised. It can be said that Chiu's previous preparations were for this condition. He had been laying the groundwork for so long, but found that this was the simplest one. After getting things done, Chiu hurriedly left the institute. Since it has been negotiated, he also needs to prepare. Communication is very important. As soon as Chiu went out, he could see Casey and Scyther training by himself from a distance. "Come here, Scyther," Chiu shouted at the Scyther that was jumping left and right not far away. As soon as the words fell, Scyther turned and stepped forward, flapping its wings quickly and turning into two gray after images. At this time, Scyther had already started, and its whole body was covered with a layer of white light, turning into a white lightning and rushing towards Chiu. The distance of more than 10 meters was shortened in an instant, and the two sharp sickles stopped just in front of Chiu. Chiu smiled and teased, "It's fancy, but this high-speed movement is well used, at least it can control the distance." Scyther raised the two sickles and touched them, which was considered to show its strength. The meaning is, I have also made progress. Chiu is not the kind of person who stands still. After the success of gathering Qi, he searched for information again, and with the help of Baoba, he finally let Scyther master the skill of high-speed movement, although it was only a simple mastery. "Tonight's extra meal," Chiu smiled and patted its shoulder. After a short pause, he continued to say to it, "The content of the experiment is to let you gradually absorb metal elements. Everything else is similar to usual, but we are going to start training." Spy Mantis nodded and agreed. For it, Chiu was responsible for such things. It was used to executing. Seeing that Spy Mantis had no problem, Chiu finally felt relieved. This matter was temporarily over, but for Xiu, the problem was not solved yet. Xiu turned his eyes to Casey not far away. After all, Casey's problem had not been solved yet, and it was even more troublesome. In order to improve his control, Casey has been gradually increasing the number of controlled objects according to the training plan set by Al-Kazam. Until now, Xiu has no idea how many things Casey can control. It's not that Xiu doesn't understand Casey. It's because of his understanding that he has this statement. Because the number of objects controlled by Casey will decrease with the weight of the object, and it is related to the mental power in the body. The combination of the two is the current control amount of Casey, which involves complex calculation methods. All Xiu can do is communicate with Casey and estimate the approximate value. In addition, controlling the movement of objects is also one aspect. These Xiu have detailed plans, but now is not the time to talk about this. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Adventurer of the Elf World. Author, Wu Nangkuang Song. Chapter 93. Xiu narrowed his eyes slightly and murmured, I don't know if Drama can do anything. But there is one more thing before that. After telling Fishan Mantis, Xiu returned to the research institute again. Doctor. I have already made an agreement with the flying mantis, and it agrees to cooperate with the experiment. Well, I understand this. I'll start after I finish what I'm doing. Drama looked very casual. Is there anything else? It's nothing. Xiu shook his head and was about to turn around and leave, but suddenly thought of something and turned around and asked, can the computer in the living room below the doctor be used? I want to use it. It's okay, just use it. Drama waved his hand like he was shooing away flies. Xiu came to Drama just to get the right to use the computer. Now that he has settled down, he must tell Baobaba and the others, and also remind Obara. It has been almost more than a month, and those people should have reacted no matter how slow they are. While Xiu was thinking about it, the computer had already been started, and the radiator was making a buzzing sound. Looking at the slowly rotating alliance icon on the screen, Xiu complained, it's been a long time since it has been started. He is probably older than me. Come on. Normally Droe wouldn't use this computer, so he probably kept it here as a display. After all, this computer is at least 5 or 6 generations different from the one above. But it's okay, it can all be used. Xiu tested it a little and found that it was quite smooth, and some basic functions could be used. As for those advanced ones, Xiu couldn't use them either. First, report to Baoba and the others that they are safe, and then explain your situation to make them feel at ease. I have been favored by Baoba and his family, so naturally I want to say something. As for what he wrote to Shirley, he only had a few more kind words and asked about Vulpix's training status. He has no relatives in this world, and Baoba and the others are the closest people. Done. Xiu dragged the mouse and clicked send, and 3 different emails were sent. After the pop-up window indicating that the transmission was successful appeared, Xiu checked the time. Even though he had already thought about what to say, it actually took him almost half an hour to type. They can be more casual with Baoba, but not with Xiao Yuan. Xiu thought for a while before starting to type on the keyboard. After the email was sent, a video invitation popped up on the computer screen before Xiu could get any more responses. Xiu hesitated for a moment before moving the mouse to take it. Is it you? Xiu heard the slightly nervous voice as soon as the call was connected. When the picture stabilized and saw O'Hara's anxious expression, Xiu couldn't help but reveal a helpless smile on his face. It's me. But when Xiao Yuan saw Xiu, the expression on his face quickly changed, and he turned into a very irritated look and shouted at Xiu. You still remember to look for me? Calm down. Xiu had already guessed the scene and didn't react much. He just opened his mouth to calm her down. Unfortunately, his words not only had no effect, but instead further aroused Obara's anger. "How dare you say this? You forgot who left me in. Keep your voice down, I'm at someone else's house." Something strange appeared. Xiao Yuan didn't stop talking, but his voice was much lower, and he spoke in a very resentful tone. Anyway, he talked a lot and criticized Xiu severely from beginning to end. And what about cultivation? She could only laugh with her in front of the screen, not forgetting to say a few words of agreement at the same time, making it clear that she would not fight back if hit or scolded, and let her vent her anger. Xiu learned from her words how much she had endured alone after she left, and how much suffering she had endured in the process of maintaining that. Okay, it's all my fault, I'm sorry for you." After she vented her anger on Xiu, her mood gradually calmed down, and her tone began to return to normal. After typing on the keyboard, she began to talk about what she had done according to Xiu's words after Xiu left, as well as the proceeds from piracy. "According to what you said, except for leaving some for emergencies, all of it will be invested in subsequent construction. The time is almost up. It's time to decentralize all piracy and completely cut off ties." "What? We have just opened up the trainer market, do we really want to give up?" Xiao Yuan seemed a little excited. After all, Xiu, the channel he had worked so hard to build, was about to give up in one sentence. What's more, the benefits brought by these channels are very considerable, who can bear this? Take a long-term view. Have you read the email I sent you? It details the pros, cons and solutions. We are not simply giving up, but giving up part of our benefits in exchange for a safer development environment, which can even increase our benefits a bit more. We only act as suppliers, spreading out the original whole and letting those who need it complete the sales part. After all, Xiu is still someone who has experienced the era of great piracy, and he knows very well how to share risks. Xiu tried his best to talk a lot, and finally analyzed the pros and cons, and Xiao Yuan, who was originally opposed to it, began to sway. "Okay, let me try." Xiu frowned when he heard her words, and changed his soft voice just now, and said sternly, "This is not a matter of trying, but about your own life. We can only survive in the cracks now. We have no strength to resist them. If you can't do it, just give up, unless you want to die miserably on the street." O'Hara was stunned for a moment, and nodded woodenly. "In front of the research institute. What are you doing?" Dr. Oak walked to Xiu and looked at the book in his hand and said, "Do you want to learn this?" Xiu closed the book, looked up and said, "Yes, you have to learn this to help the doctor to carry out experiments. This is quite difficult. It took me a week to learn the basics." Dr. Oak saw him like this and immediately became interested, and reached out to pick up the book that Xiu was looking at. Dr. Oak flipped a few pages and handed the book back to Xiu, saying, "You are just starting to learn, so this book is not suitable for you." Xiu closed the book, and the title of the book was revealed, Ancient Characters, From Entry to Burial. "I don't understand these. I found this book on the bookshelf in the study. This book you are reading is for those who are preparing for archaeology. Most of it is related to archaeology. You need a certain foundation to understand it. No wonder I think the name is a bit strange." Xiu didn't explain anything, but admitted it very straightforwardly. "The books about ancient characters are in the study. You have to look for them. Most of the books outside are not suitable for beginners like you." Adventurer of the Elf World. Author, Wu Nangkuang Song. Chapter 94. "Well, does the doctor have any books to recommend to me?" Xiu asked with a smile. He certainly knew that most of the books in the study were not suitable for him, but the problem was that he didn't know what books beginners should learn. Unlike the bookshelves in Baoba's house, the books in the study of the research institute were not classified at all, just placed like that. Wait for me. Dr. Oak could also see what Xiu wanted to do, and left a word and re-entered the research institute. Sitting at the door, Xiu wanted to get up and see what Dr. Oak was doing, but before he walked in, Dr. Oak came towards him, and he was holding something in his hand. "Hey, it just so happens that I haven't sorted out the books in the study for a long time. Go and sort them out when you have time." "Thank you, Doctor." Xiu took the several reference books handed over by Dr. Oak with surprise. "You can read books, but don't delay your business." Dr. Oak couldn't help but pour a basin of cold water on Xiu's joint. "Yes. Please rest assured, Doctor, I will definitely feed the elves on time," Xiu immediately answered seriously. "What else?" "Also ensure the doctor's 3 meals a day." "What else?" "What else?" Xiu looked at Dr. Oak in confusion. When he saw him looking at him, he quickly raised the key and said, "And organize the library?" "I'm talking about the experiment of Scyther." Dr. Oak looked helpless. Why did he feel that his decision was too rash? "Doctor, you're talking about this?" Xiu put down his raised arm and put away the key casually. "At this time," he continued, "isn't this waiting for your plan, Doctor? I have no problem here. The materials I ordered haven't arrived yet, but some experiments can be carried out tomorrow," Dr. Oak said casually, as if he didn't care much about Xiu's question. Materials? Xiu was very curious about the materials mentioned by Dr. Oak. What materials were he going to prepare? Dr. Oak smiled when he saw Xiu like this. "Yes, I ordered a batch of metals, all kinds of metals." Xiu could clearly hear Dr. Oak emphasize the word all kinds. There must be something wrong. Dr. Oak didn't let him wait for long and then explained. "I found that the metal elements that exceeded the standard in Scyther's body were not just iron. Although iron accounted for the largest proportion, reaching more than 90%, there were also some other metal elements found. So I want to test the difference in Scyther's affinity for different metals to see if it is only affinity for iron. Does this make any difference to Scyther?" Xiu is still quite concerned about this issue. Although ordinary metals may not cause any serious problems to Scyther, after all, there is a big difference between the bodies of humans and elves. But some special metals may not be certain. After all, heavy metal poisoning is not a very strange thing. "This difference is huge." Dr. Oak smiled and asked casually, "Do you know the weakness of giant claw mantis?" "Can't fly," Xiu thought for a while and said. Dr. Oak was stunned for a moment, and then said, "Although this is also one, it is not the most important one. It's fire and physical strength." Xiu was just joking just now, but the fun was gone when he faced Dr. Oak, a native who didn't understand him at all. He certainly knew that the biggest weakness of the giant claw mantis was fire and that it couldn't fight for a long time. However, compared with the many attribute weaknesses of Scyther, the giant claw mantis only has one, which is considered good. Seeing that Xiu finally said it, Dr. Oak continued to ask, "Then do you know what the root cause is?" Xiu's first reaction was, "What reason can there be for this? It's just attribute restraint." However, there is no such statement yet, and he doesn't think Dr. Oak's question will be so simple. Xiu didn't rush to answer, but thought about the keyword metal for a while before speaking. The doctor said before that the iron content in modern evolutionary materials is 80%. Is it because of this? Dr. Oak nodded, which was considered to be an approval of his answer, and then continued to ask, "Then do you know why evolutionary materials choose iron instead of other metals?" "I don't know," Xiu answered very straightforwardly. This was indeed beyond his ability. "Because this is the simplest, it has been verified in ancient times. This is the metal with the highest success rate." Xiu suddenly said, "I think it is better to say that this has the least impact on Scyther. No matter what the affinity is, the body can still accept a part of the iron element, and the rejection reaction is not so strong." Xiu suddenly felt that this experiment was not so simple. He seemed to have been set up. He didn't say anything about metal when he said it at the beginning. The old man is still the best, this old guy. Although he knew that he was cheated, Xiu didn't cry and scream at the first time, but calmed down to think about this problem. Doctor, is it possible to change a method to verify it instead of directly letting Scyther absorb various metals? Then what do you have? Dr. Oak looked at him strangely, as if wondering why he said such a thing. After a brief thought, Xiu asked, Doctor, you want to verify Scyther's absorption of different metals, right? This is just one point. There is also the effect of this metal on Scyther. This is the foundation of the subsequent experiments. What? Do you have any good methods? Dr. Oak looked at him with interest when he saw him like this, because he knew that if he didn't have any ideas, Xiu would not ask such questions. Since he asked, it means that he has ideas. Xiu didn't say it directly, but threw out another question. Maybe, but I want to ask whether the absorption of metal by Scyther is an active or passive process. Is it related to its current physical signs? This. Dr. Oak didn't understand why Xiu asked this question that had nothing to do with it, but still answered, although this cannot be said for sure, it should be passive absorption based on the current situation. As for the relationship with the physical signs of Scyther, it is hard to say, because I don't have any research on this. Then you can try it, Xiu said to himself, and then ran to the warehouse after leaving a sentence. Doctor, wait for me first. Looking at Xiu's back as he left, Dr. Oak was thinking about what method he would use to replace this experiment. Xiu went and came back quickly. It took less than 3 minutes for him to come back from the warehouse, and he had something in his hand. What is this? Professor Oak asked, looking at the small bag in his hand. Xiu opened the bag and handed it over, saying, This is the sickle fragment I collected before. If possible, it seems better to use this. There is no need for complicated inspections. Just start with the weight to get accurate data. But yours is already. Adventurer of the Elf World. Author, Wu Nangkuang Song. Chapter 95. Xiu interrupted Dr. Oak and said at an alarming speed, Doctor, the sickle of scythe is not connected to other organs of the body. If so, what is the difference between these and the sickle on scythe? Hey! You can't say that. Dr. Oak was about to refute something, but he stopped for some reason. Looking at the fragments in his hand, he murmured, This is also a direction. We can try it. I think there is no problem with this. Xiu smiled very confidently. He couldn't be unconfident. He could only hope that this would be useful. Okay, I'll go test this material now. Dr. Oak, who got the fragments, seemed more anxious than Xiu, and went upstairs with the things. It's difficult. How can we bear it like this? Xiu sat on the ground and complained casually after Dr. Oak left. However, Dr. Oak's words just now also gave him some inspiration. The characteristics of iron are definitely not as good as steel. If it is an alloy giant claw mantis, will there be another gain? I don't know if the metal in this world is the same as that on Earth, otherwise, wouldn't it be invincible if we made a super alloy giant mantis? However, Xiu was just thinking about it, and he was still confused about the metal in this world, so he needed to look up some information. Finally done. Sitting on a chair stacked with boxes of rations, Xiu raised his hands above his head and stretched his body as much as possible. The whole day was spent studying and working, and at night he had to think about Casey's training, Scyther's experiments, and Xiao Fuden's training plan, all of which he had to worry about. The days can be said to be very fulfilling, too fulfilling. But this kind of life not only did not make him feel tired, but full of energy. The feeling of doing something you like and being forced to do something is very different. In his previous life, he was more willing to study those ways to make money, and it was simply a death for him to study, especially for foreign language courses. But today, in order to understand ancient characters, he wrote several pages of notes alone, and he only read a dozen pages of books. It's not that he's too stupid, but there are too many things to remember. One word has several meanings, and this is a distorted hieroglyphic. There is no skill, just rote memorization. Even if his brain is more active than normal people, it can't withstand such high-intensity use. From this, it can be seen that Dr. Oak is really a genius, otherwise he can't learn the basics in just 1 week. Although he is confident that he can learn ancient characters, time waits for no one. The experiment of Scythe will start tomorrow, and if he still can't understand it, there is a high possibility that he will be cheated again. Oh! Right, Jiu suddenly thought of a way. Before he crossed over, he didn't know the language and characters of this world. He only understood these after receiving the memories of the original owner. Now he doesn't have the ability to remember everything, but Casey does. As long as Casey remembers it and copies and pastes it to him, doesn't that mean he has learned it too? Shiu suddenly felt that he was very smart. He could even think of such a method. It's just that execution is a problem. Shiu doesn't know the difficulty. Originally, he wanted to ask Casey to come out to discuss, but now it was very late, and it was completely unnecessary for him to wake up Casey, who had been training all day. And whether this was possible was still unknown. Ha ha ha, Shiu suddenly laughed and said to himself, it's like thinking of all kinds of ways to prepare for the final exam. Lazy dogs always want to take shortcuts no matter what they do. Even if Shiu knows what kind of person he is, he still finds it a bit ridiculous. Lazy dog is going to sleep. Shiu said to himself after getting into the bed, I hope tomorrow will still be a day full of hope. Shiu got up early in the morning. It's late spring and early summer now, and the weather is already a little hot. Get up, Shiu let them out with his backhand, then got up and pushed open the door of the warehouse. Watching them come out one after another, Shiu twisted his neck and said, today's situation is a bit special. Scythe will cooperate with the experiment later, so it will not be with you at that time. Casey, you practice first, I will come to help you adjust later. As for Xiaofuden, just don't get lost. Scythe, you go first, I have something else to do. After Shiu briefly explained, he put food in the backyard for the elves in advance, and then left breakfast for Casey and the others, and came to the research institute. Just right, now follow me to get the goods. Dr. Oak saw them coming in and then reacted, muttering, I almost forgot the business. Yes. Shiu didn't bring the elves, and followed Dr. Oak alone in the town. This is the first time he has come out since he entered the research institute 2 days ago, but now his identity is different. Before, he was a passerby, and now he is an assistant. The research institute is a distance away from the town, and the surrounding area is just ordinary flat land, which seems a bit monotonous. By the way, I rarely hear you talk about your parents. They actually dared to let you come here alone. Dr. Oak teased with a smile on his face, they are really generous. Aren't they afraid that something will happen to you? Who said it wasn't? They disappeared when I was 3 years old. As soon as Shiu said these words, Dr. suddenly didn't know what to say. Before, he thought that Shiu came here to ask for help under Baoba's order. He didn't know that Shiu was still an orphan. Now that he thought about it, his words seemed a little bit too much. Shiu also noticed Dro's look and knew that he might be struggling with what he just said, so he said casually, Doctor, don't mind. I don't remember most of their things. I even forgot what they looked like, but they did teach me something. What is it? Dr. looked at Shiu curiously, and he heard a slightly different meaning in what he just said. Stay alive, use all means to survive. Shiu spoke slower and slower, until the last few words became gritted teeth. Shiu doesn't have much feeling about the topic of parents, although he became an orphan when he was 3 years old and struggled alone in an orphanage. But he is not a child, and he knows very well how ridiculous it is to blame these things on that insubstantial figure. He just wants to live in the present. Droki also noticed Chiu's situation, took the initiative to change the topic, and introduced Chiu to the geographical situation along the way. Here we go. Soon there were people walking around on the road, and there were more people in front of those houses. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Adventurer of the Elf World. Author, Wu Nangkuang Song. Chapter 96. Hello, Dr. Oak. The townspeople who passed by would greet Dr. Oak from time to time, and some would even pull him to chat about family matters, but Dr. Oak at this time did not seem to be annoyed, but could chat for a few words before leaving. But when those people learned about Chiu's situation, most of them felt a little surprised, and this reaction made Chiu a little strange. I don't have to go out anymore with you in the future. Dr. Oak was a little more normal when he walked to a place with fewer people, and said like a complaint, it's better to stay in the laboratory. Chiu didn't feel strange that Dr. Oak was essentially a otaku. After all, research geeks all have this situation. Chiu estimated that if Dr. Oak was not afraid that he didn't know the way, he would probably let him come out alone to get his things. Dr. Oak. There are your things. An old man stood at the door and waved to them and shouted. Hey, Dr. Oak responded, and then took Chiu over. It was a store in the town. Chiu looked at the decoration in the house. It seemed that the old man was just moving the boxes of goods out and setting them up. Those are your things. They arrived yesterday. The old man pointed to a big box in the corner and said. Chiu, go help. Professor Oak patted Chiu's shoulder and pushed him out. Chiu was stunned for a moment, then began to help the old man move the things out. Professor Oak was studying his big box. When did you come to Pallet Town? Why haven't I seen you before? The old man asked while working. My name is Chiu, and I'm an assistant at the institute now. Assistant, the old man seemed to have heard something very surprising. His eyes were round, but he quickly reacted, carefully glanced at Professor Oak beside him, and then gradually returned to normal. Chiu could of course see the old man's big reaction, but he didn't ask much. After all, Professor Oak was still here. However, Chiu was sure that there must be something wrong with the assistant of the Oak Institute, and it should be a big problem. No wonder Chiu felt that something was wrong before, it turned out to be here. I was wondering why there was only Professor Oak in such a big institute, and why there was a bed in the utility room. Although Chiu didn't show his emotion on the surface, he couldn't help but curse in his heart, damn, why am I so unlucky? I have problems wherever I go. But it's useless to think about these things now. He has just settled down and hasn't done anything he was going to do. If he acts rashly now, it may disrupt his plan. However, this matter must be investigated clearly. What does Professor Oak's assistant represent? Why did those people along the way have no reaction, but this old man had such a big reaction? There were not many things, and Chiu quickly helped the old man to sort them out. However, Professor Oak hadn't counted the things clearly at this time, so Chiu started chatting with the old man. The old man's name is Xiao He. He was also a trainer when he was young, but he was not very successful. When he reached middle age, he returned to his hometown and opened such a small shop. He grew up in Pallet Town since he was a child and has been here for almost 50 years. Because of the location problem, his shop also helps some townspeople collect some express parcels. Because Xiu had always been curious about the situation in Pallet Town before, the two of them talked about this topic. Then Xiu discovered that the main industry of the residents in the town was actually selling materials. No wonder every household is so separated, and there are all kinds of plants growing in the fields above. Xiu originally thought it was a garden, but it turned out to be a medicinal field. Following this question, Xiu asked about some information about tree fruits. There are not many edible fruits in Kanto. Only peach fruit, blue orange, and red apple are native species, and they have a positive effect on elves? Most of the other fruits are just ordinary fruits. As for those transplanted varieties, there are also some, but they are all useful to elves as part of the materials. Then the price difference between the two should be quite large, right? It's okay. Ordinary fruits are not expensive, but they can just meet people's needs. Some fruits can only be sold in big cities because they are divided according to materials, and there is not much demand in towns. Xiu also understood what the old man meant, that is, ordinary fruits are mainly for humans, and a large part of the fruits native to Kanto are acceptable to ordinary people at this price. And some fruits with special effects, that is, tree fruits, are sold as materials. The difference is not ordinary, and the most prominent one is the word price. When there is no such fruit locally, the price will be even higher. When Chiu was in the light red city, he saw many fruit being sold as materials, but some of the effects did not match, and the names were strange, with the same fruit having several names. This reminded Chiu of the names of the medicinal materials in his previous life. Many people took the wrong medicine because of this, and the consequences may be nothing, but there are also serious cases where they are directly killed. There is no concept of fruit now. After all, there are many fruits in the wild, but they may not have various effects on the elves. And fruit is a general term for fruits that have effects on the elves. Xiu felt it was necessary to understand these. Yes, everything has been checked. Professor Oak stood up and put the paper and pen back into his pocket, then turned to them and asked, "What are you talking about?" "Let's talk about these fruits," Xiu answered first, then walked to the box and asked, "Are we moving them back now?" Yeah, Dr. Oak nodded, then turned to Xiaohe and said, "Let's go back first." "Okay, okay," the old man smiled and nodded and waved, "Be careful." Xiu ignored the polite words between the two old men, but bent down to pick up the box. Not to mention, it's really heavy, and when he picked it up, he could feel the shaking inside. There should be a lot of small things. However, the box has been sealed, and he doesn't know how much is inside. Anyway, one thing is certain, that is metal. "Bring those petri dishes here." Dr. Oak pointed to the side without raising his head. "Yes," Xiu quickly responded and picked up the petri dishes before. Xiu could even see the fragments soaked in an unknown liquid. "What are these liquids, doctor?" "Liquids containing metal elements," Dr. Oak answered casually without paying any attention to Xiu's question, and then immediately pointed to another place, "Go and start that machine." "Yes." Because Xiu's proposal yesterday was feasible, the experiment on Scyther was postponed, and the fragments were studied first. When Xiu knew that the fragments were useful, the first thing he thought of was that he didn't collect more at that time. In that situation, he just had a collecting habit, took a few large pieces, and didn't care about the other fragments. Now it seems that it is still a little short. Adventurer of the Elf World. Author, Wu Nangkuang Song. Chapter 97. After a period of inspection, Dr. looked at the data on the computer and was silent. After Xiu saw it, he also asked slightly uneasily, "Doctor, what is the situation now?" "My guess is correct. The flying mantis does absorb different metals differently. At least that's the current situation." "Then what?" "Now, you can see for yourself." Dro kicked off his computer chair and moved it to the side, freeing up the space in front of the computer. Xiaoya didn't care whether he could understand it or not. He leaned forward and stared at the screen. How to put it, although he couldn't understand what these data meant, he could probably still figure it out. After all, you can guess what it means from the 98% marked on the back of the iron element. Iron is the highest, followed by a list of other metal names. If I hadn't repaired the metal names in this world before, some of them would be unrecognizable. There's nothing strange about this. Isn't it normal for iron to be the best in compatibility? This is really not an afterthought, but he did say that the flying mantis must have the highest compatibility with iron, otherwise ancient people wouldn't have used iron. And this setting has not changed until modern times. There must be a reason for this. Since the affinity for iron is best found in the group of flying mantises, it would also apply to his flying mantis. But I don't want to use iron to evolve the flying mantis. Shiu looked at Dromu in confusion. What kind of situation is this? I wonder if it would be a waste of talent to just simulate the world's first giant mantis. Think about it, what if the flying praying mantis absorbs iron elements and evolves? It doesn't prove the theory we want to overturn at all. After all, others can say that we are faking it. What if we come up with an extraordinary giant pincer praying mantis? Dromu immediately squeezed Shiu out and sat in front of the computer again. His fingers were tapping quickly on the keyboard, and then a series of data was called up. Look, this is the information I have about the giant pincer mantis. Shiu quickly glanced at the things on the screen and asked, what next? What's the difference between this giant clawed mantis and this one? What's the research value? I might as well go find a giant clawed mantis directly. Doctor, Shiu narrowed his eyes, my flying mantis is not your toy. Don't be anxious yet. Dromu didn't care about Shiu's tone, and waved his hand casually and continued, if you want the giant pincer mantis to overcome its weakness of flame, you can't use iron as the evolutionary material. Shiu did not refuse in a hurry, but asked tentatively, Doctor, what kind of metal do you want to use? There is no metal in the world that meets my conditions. Dromu closed his eyes and shook his head. Strength, melting point, and weight must all be taken into consideration. Alloy. Dromu didn't even open his eyes, he leaned his whole body on the computer chair and said in a lazy tone. You don't have to think about this. Anyway, I promised you that I would use the best materials. But we also have to consider the tolerance of the flying praying mantis, in case. I have thought of this a long time ago. Dromu suddenly opened his eyes, stood up from the chair, walked to the petri dishes and picked up one of them. Look, these are fragments soaked in various metal elements. Their combination is better than I imagined, otherwise I wouldn't propose this plan. When Shiu saw Dromu's obsessed look when he looked at the petri dish, he knew that the matter was not that simple. I'm afraid Dromu has had this idea for a long time, but he just said it now. Dromu held the petri dish in both hands and said to himself, this will be a perfect giant clawed mantis. The giant pincer mantis that overcomes its weaknesses is indeed what I want, but I refuse. Shiu suddenly interrupted Dromu's fantasy, this kind of experiment is not what I want. Shiu's words caused Dromu to look at him, but at this time, Dromu seemed to have returned to his normal appearance, and answered with a chuckle. Don't worry, your flying mantis is so rare. It's so rare that there may only be one like it in the world. So I pay more attention to the health of the flying mantis than you as a trainer. I won't start the experiment until I'm sure. And Dromu looked at Shiu and smiled strangely, and said, as a trainer of a giant mantis with no weaknesses, have you ever thought about what you will get? Fame, money, and strength will be at your fingertips. Alas, doctor, what you said is not very attractive to me. I just want them to live well. Regarding what Dromu said, Shiu was very rational. This method of drawing a pie had long lost any effect in front of him, and the doctor only said part of it. If such a giant mantis really appeared, for him, that one it would be a ticking time bomb. There is an old saying that goes, every man is innocent, but he is guilty of having a jade. Possessing a giant mantis that is unique in the world may not be a big deal to Dromu. After all, no one in the world dares to try his luck. But it is a trouble for such a miscellaneous fish as Shiu. Big trouble. Wealthy collectors, researchers, big companies, and the like will spend a lot of money on the black market, and countless hunters will gather like sharks smelling blood. Shiu can even foresee that something will happen as soon as he leaves the institute, because there are too many people in the world who want to get the giant mantis from him. After all, The title of unique in the world is too big, and Jiu can't suppress it at all. Tomorrow I will train the strength of Scyther. Before the experiment starts, I have to strengthen the physique and strength of Scyther. This will play a big role in the later experiments. This is good for Scyther. Jiu knows that it is difficult to strengthen its strength in a short time with his level. It is better to see what the teacher mentioned by Professor Oak has. Then he can learn from him. The experiment is still going on, but it has nothing to do with Jiu because he is off work. I'm so tired. Jiu walked out of the institute with his head down. Today, he was pulled over by Professor Oak to help all day, and he was also responsible for the elves in the backyard and some miscellaneous things. He didn't even have a chance to touch a book today. And I have to talk to Scyther about these things when I get back. More importantly, there are still many things that have not been completed today. Adventurer of the Elf World. Author, Wu Nangkuang Song. Chapter 98. For example, scheduled debugging with Casey, a morning run with Flying Mantis, and some other random chores. Although the sun has gone down, there is still a layer of orange in the sky, and Jiu can still see objects in the distance clearly as he walks to the warehouse. Now Flying Mantis and Casey haven't finished training yet, and they are each working hard at their own positions. Jiu shouted at the warehouse door. Come here, everyone. Today's training is over. As for little Lucky Egg, he has already gone back to his pokeball to sleep. He is already tired from playing all day. Come on, let's eat something to replenish our strength first. Jiu took out a few red apples and handed them to them, but the Flying Mantis had to feed them himself. After helping them with the simple processing, I took out a pen and paper and said to Casey, I'm sorry I'm too busy today. Jiu actually helps Casey record the increase in mental power and the degree of control over it every day. Without the measurement of cutting-edge instruments, we can only rely on feeling, so the results are very vague, but Jiu will still record it. This is a reference standard that allows Jiu to judge how far Casey is now and whether he has any maybe out of control or something. Relying on Casey's telepathy, Jiu quickly wrote out today's data. Just comparing the data he looked at with the previous one, he felt a change. After settling down in the past few days, the amount of mental power has increased compared with before, and the fluctuation of mental power has also become unstable. What is the reason for this? Obviously Casey has been training all day. And Casey's training is all about control. He suddenly had a very bad premonition and murmured, could it be that? Jiu briefly analyzed it and found that the situation happened just a few days after he settled down in the research institute. There was only one change in Casey in the past few days, and that was a lot of training, which was different from sleeping in the elf ball before. Frequent use of mental power will stimulate the growth of the brain and accelerate the growth of mental power, but this will also have an impact on the fluctuation of mental power. It's now known that sleeping inside a pokeball can alleviate the symptoms, but there's a problem. It's just that if there is no training, Casey's control will not keep up with the growth of his mental power, and something will happen. This is a dead end. How do you get out of it? Jiu's brows were furrowed, his eyes were fixed on the small notebook, and the hand holding the pen kept knocking on it, as if he didn't even see the many black spots on the paper. Casey also noticed Jiu's reaction, but there was no change. It was even feeding the Flying Mantis. The Flying Mantis on the side also noticed something was wrong, but it didn't say anything and ate silently. After a long time, Jiu closed the small notebook, raised his head and looked at the two of them with a smile, and said, "Don't worry, I will solve it. Now you can go and rest." After Casey and Flying Mantis returned to the pokeball, the smile on Jiu's face disappeared, leaving only solemnity. He stood there for a while before he became active and started running around the backyard, getting faster and faster. He needs exercise to relax, otherwise the stress will consume him. The second floor of the institute. Dr. Oki stood by the window, looked at Chiu, who was running around the backyard below, and said with a smile, "Young people are energetic. It seems that the workload tomorrow can be appropriately increased, otherwise it will be wasted." But the smile on Dro's face gradually calmed down, and he said to himself, "Is this the boy with strange thoughts you mentioned? Do you want to change me?" Xiu yawned and got up from the bed, glanced at the surroundings calmly, and then pushed open the warehouse door. After seeing the same scenery a few times, you will no longer have the same feeling as before, which is aesthetic fatigue. Come out. Chiu raised his hand to release a few elves and said, "Good morning." He didn't even remember what time he went to bed last night. Firstly, he had to complete the amount of reading he had set for each day, and also he was tossing and turning about Kathy's affairs, which made him look like this now. A year's plan begins in spring, a day's plan begins in the morning. Xiu was still a little sleepy at first, but after a series of labors, he finally recovered temporarily and no longer looked like a salty fish. "Okay, you guys eat first, I'm going to have breakfast too." After arranging breakfast for several elves, Xiu walked towards the research institute. "But why don't we see Dramu come out today?" Normally, Xiu would see Dramu wandering around in the morning. Xiu glanced at the time. It was almost 7 o'clock now. In his previous life, he could sleep until 11 o'clock before getting up, but 7 o'clock was already late in this world. The reason why Xiu was worried was because he didn't have the key to the research institute. If he wanted to go in, he would have to ask Droe to open the door. What if Droe was upset when he woke up? Forget it, forget it. Xiu stood in front of the institute door, shook his head, and then knocked on the door. "If you don't go in, won't you be able to complete your work? It will be bad if there is any more trouble then." PhD. He was originally prepared to be scolded, but no one opened the door after knocking for a while. Xiu stood at the door and muttered to himself, "What's going on? You won't die suddenly, right? I heard that there are many people like this in this industry." It's really not Xiu's malicious intent, but it's really possible for people with such irregular lifestyles to stay up late and eat instant noodles every day that this kind of situation will happen. "What are you doing?" Suddenly, a voice came from behind, which startled Xiu. He turned around and saw, wasn't this Dramu? "Doctor, why are you here? I knocked on the door for a long time but no one opened it." Dramu reached out to open the door of the research institute and walked in first. He said at the same time, "Isn't this door open? Hey. I thought the doctor hadn't gotten up yet." Xiu ignored the teasing tone in Dro's tone and followed him directly. "You'll find out later." Dramu smiled and separated from Xiu at the stairs. After Dramu left, Xiu walked to the kitchen and murmured, "Is it related to me? Is it related to the flying praying mantis?" After breakfast, Dramu did not get into the laboratory on the second floor this time, but called Xiu to the backyard. Said Xiu wanted to meet the opponent he was looking for flying mantis. Still very curious about this Xiu, he followed Dramu to guess the identity of his opponent. The backyard is peaceful. The elves here don't have to participate in the battles in the wild, and they don't have to worry about eating and drinking. All they want is to live a carefree life every day. Go and call your flying mantis over. Dro stood in a corner of the backyard close to the research institute, far away from the research institute and not disturbing the elves. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Adventurer of the Elf World. Author, Wu Nangkuang Song. Chapter 99. Yes, Xiu immediately trotted along and soon called Scyther over. Professor Oak looked at Xiu and Scyther and said, "Let's have a fight before the introduction." Xiu was stunned for a moment, then smiled and said, "It's my honor to see Professor Oak take action." Professor Oak just smiled and said nothing, then took out a Pokeball from his pocket and released a Pokemon. When Xiu saw this Pokemon, his brows furrowed. This Pokemon has no visible limbs, only 2 layers of bowl-shaped structures at the top and bottom of its body. The inner layer is red, looks smooth, and the material is unknown, while the outer layer is very light pink, and there are uneven grooves and serrated edges on it. It looks like a rock, but Xiu is not sure. After all, it looks too strange. Under these bowl-shaped structures should be its true body, but with a shell. Now Xiu can only see the big black and white eyes through the gap, and there are 4 tube-like protrusions extending from 4 directions. This strange-looking thing is called Foretos. Xiu remembered that it was the evolved form of hazelnut ball, but he didn't remember the rest. After all, this Pokemon seemed to be in Xiaogong's hand, so he only had a vague impression of it. In the game, Xiu never used it, not for any reason, just because it didn't look handsome enough. So Xiu's understanding of Foretos was still at the level of appearance. Foretos. Xiu frowned and patted Scyther's shoulder. Scyther understood Xiu's meaning and walked out to stand opposite Foretos, holding 2 sickles in front of him. Even if Xiu didn't know much about Foretos, he knew that Scyther would definitely not be good against it. After all, Scyther's advantages were gone in front of it, and it was even countered. That is, it couldn't be split. Scyther's sickle would suffer against these Pokemon with solid shells. If it really went on the field, Casey might have a better chance of winning. Looks like you're ready. The smile on Professor Oak's face has never stopped, from the time Xiu started observing Foretos until now. The 2 elves had already taken their positions, but Professor Oak had no intention of taking the initiative, and he looked as leisurely as an old man taking a walk, but the pressure on Xiu was no less. It's just that Xiu didn't intend to take the initiative either, and Scyther might find a chance to mess around, but he didn't dare to think about winning. Scyther would definitely suffer if he took the initiative now. If Casey was on the field, Xiu would have directly ordered Foretos to be dragged to a high altitude and then used a superpower version of Earth Throw. Blunt weapons are often the most useful for heavily armored enemies, and any hard shell is a coffin board in front of a strong impact. But there is no such option. Xiu's heart was calculated and he had to find a way to give Scyther a long-range skill when he returned, otherwise he would not even be qualified to fight a war of attrition if he encountered the situation again. Move and find an opportunity. Xiu finally managed to say something useless. If he waited any longer, his momentum would collapse. By then, he would not even be qualified to mix. He could only find opportunities in the movement. Scyther also knew what Xiu meant, and used his expertise to go around and think behind Foretos. Xiu looked at Professor Oak at this time, but he had no intention of commanding at all, and looked at the court as if he was watching a play. Is he not going to command? Since Professor Oak wanted him to, Xiu must seize the opportunity to struggle. What if he succeeded? Gather chi and then use split on the gap in the middle. If there was a better choice, Xiu would definitely not let Scyther use this trick, but Scyther only knew these few tricks. Not to mention him, even if Professor Oak came, it would be useless. Scyther stomped his feet and rushed towards Foretos. During the period, a layer of luster appeared on his body, but it disappeared in an instant, but Scyther's overall momentum suddenly increased by 3 points. Scythe raised the knife and swung it. This action has been practiced by Scythe for no less than 10,000 times. Especially when it entered the gathering chi state, it was fully confident that it could chop into the narrow gap. But the opponent was not a piece of wood that could stand and be chopped by Scythe. After hearing what Xiu said, Foretos also took action. But its reaction seemed a bit strange to Xiu. Xiu originally thought that it would use only a few skills, either Iron Wall to shrink, or high-speed rotation or Gyro Ball, which are defensive attack skills that make it impossible for Scythe to attack. If he were to command, it would definitely be like this, both playing to its own advantages and not being afraid of Scythe's attack. But this Foretos without Professor Oak's command used, Shiu didn't know how to describe it, Foretos actually flew up. Damn! What is this? Scythes with wings can only glide, but it, a wingless one, actually flew up. Actually, it's not flying, but it's almost like floating, but the sudden levitation just now gave people the same feeling as flying. In the past, when playing games, I almost always floated, so it wouldn't be strange to meet Foretos, but this is real life. Shiu suffered a major blow without any preparation, and the knife that Scyther was determined to win also missed. Scyther, kick it up, Shiu suddenly woke up and shouted at Scyther. Spy Mantis didn't know what was going on, but he followed Shiu's instructions faithfully. He took a step forward and approached Foretos, then kicked Foretos from below, and Foretos flew out like a cannonball. Follow up and hit him, then hit him back, Shiu continued to shout, his eyes fixed on Foretos in the air. The thin wings behind Spy Mantis spread out, then shook rapidly, and a gust of wind pressure spread out from the starting point of Spy Mantis, blowing the surrounding grass down. Then, with the help of the powerful bouncing force and the leverage of the wings, Spy Mantis flew up easily, and then swung the sickle blade, that is, the blade surface, to hit Foretos' bottom. The cooperation between Spy Mantis and Shiu also caught the opponent off guard. It took no more than 2 seconds from Shiu's order to Spy Mantis's hit, and the second combo was even more perfect. Foretos was almost as soon as he finished speaking. It just seemed that he couldn't connect. Shiu glanced around and saw that there was no place for Scyther to gain leverage. He could only watch Scyther fall. Both of them were looking at Foretos, who was free falling in the air. Adventurer of the Elf World. Author, Wu Nangkuang Song. Chapter 100. Originally, I wanted to hit Fritos into the sky with a combo, and then use a smash to see if I could hit Fritos hard with the help of gravity. After all, the risk involved in slashing was too high, and it was basically difficult to break. The opponent's defense. The height wasn't high enough the first time, or maybe he was greedy, so he didn't choose to shoot downwards but upwards the second time. But according to his estimation, even if it were shot from this height, it wouldn't cause much damage. But now Shiu has changed his mind. Because just by watching Fritos fall to the ground lightly, he knew that his idea would not work. Sure enough, you can't do this when dealing with a flying person. And Fritos was not an existence left to be beaten by the flying mantis. The moment he landed, the uneven shell on the outside started spinning before landing. When it touched the ground, the whole Fritos suddenly changed direction and hit the flying mantis. It was obvious that Fritos landed towards the ground, and there was no turning point during the process. He just hit the ground and hit the flying mantis. However, Fritos' speed was still slightly inferior to the flying mantis. It easily dodged the impact without even needing to be reminded. But the next attack came immediately. After the flying mantis dodged, Fritos hit the ground, but it didn't stop, and even spun faster. The moment it touched the ground, it bounced up again, also aiming at the flying mantis, and this time the speed is faster. Shiu had been observing Fritos. If the first time he suddenly flew towards the flying mantis was a coincidence, then the second time was a slap in his face. So there is only one explanation. This Fritos can change its direction by relying on the force generated by the rotation of the shell and the collision with the ground or objects, and this direction can be controlled by itself. So scary, so scary. As Fritos' speed gradually increased, flying mantis dodge became increasingly difficult. Seeing this, Shiu quickly commanded, "Go to the edge of the woods, not here." This move is a bit overwhelming in such an open space, so you need to use the venue to limit its ability. The flying mantis also understands the meaning of cultivation, but now it has been restricted to a certain area, and it is no longer so easy to escape. Crack the ground. Lift up the turf and disrupt its rhythm. The situation was constantly changing, Xiu immediately added after seeing the flying mantis in this state. Flying mantis swung his sickle and slashed across the ground. A piece of turf the size of a wash basin was blocked in front of him under the intentional control of flying mantis, and he collided with Fritos. Although Fritos broke up the turf easily, the strange balance was also interrupted. It did not bounce up again, but gradually slowed down. Only then did Xiu see the condition of Fritos. The tooth-like edge on the pink outer layer had been closed, and only 4 red tubes were leaking out of the red inner layer. There were no eyes or anything else. Oh, Xiu sighed at this time. Originally, he wanted the flying mantis to come up and have a look, but now it seems that Fritos didn't give him a chance. But Xiu discovered another thing, that is, the spinning Fritos would lose his vision and hearing. Just now I thought the turf was a flying mantis, otherwise it would have had no need to stop just now. It could come back just by turning slightly. But it happened to stop, and now there is only this reason. But when it spins up again, how does it determine the position of the flying mantis? That's right. It's electromagnetic waves, or magnetic fields. Now it seems that Fritos must have relied on the magnetic field to sense the elf, but just now the turf and the flying mantis overlapped for a moment, so Fritos thought he had hit the flying mantis and stopped. Now that he has discovered this flaw, Xiu is not afraid that it will try this trick again, but now Xiu still has no way to break through Fritos' shell and really hit it. The sudden change that Fritos would stop was also unexpected by flying mantis. Originally, he was already prepared to dodge the next attack, but who knew it would be like this? Seeing that Xiu had no new command, the flying mantis did not run into the woods, but stood on guard. There was no move until Fritos came to a complete stop. Doctor, there is absolutely no point in continuing the fight like this. It's better to forget it. Seeing the way Fritos was on guard, Xiu had no interest in taking action. Dramu looked at Fritos on the field and smiled and said, "Be careful, Fritos' true strength has not been shown at all." Hearing this sentence, Xiu wanted to vomit blood. Is this a question of whether his strength has been demonstrated? This is a problem that has no chance at all. There is absolutely no need to fight this. Then can I replace the elf? Xiu asked half probingly, half complainingly. Cassie felt that he had a good chance of winning. After all, this Fritos didn't look very strong. Hearing Xiu's words, Dramu shook his head. This Fritos is the one I called from the back mountain just now. They have a gentle temperament and usually stay in the trees relying on their hard shells. They rarely participate in battles. And your flying mantis looks like this even against such an elf with little combat experience. It's hard to imagine how you trained it before. Xiu has no intention of defending this issue. After all, he is indeed a novice. He has never systematically studied how to cultivate elves. He only relied on a few books and his own ideas to become a monk halfway. So what Professor Oak said was right. According to the survival rules in the wild, they have been fighting since they were born, and Xiu is only planning to start now, so this is indeed his problem. Seeing that Xiu did not refute, Professor Oak continued, "This is the training I intend to introduce to you. It is called fighting." Xiu looked up at Professor Oak fiercely, then looked at the two elves confronting each other on the field, and murmured, "Is it back to this question? Does Xiu not know that fighting is the fastest way for elves to grow? But why has Xiu avoided the fights that can be avoided so far, and will find ways to solve the unavoidable ones in a way that is better than fighting? It is because he thinks that there is no need to fight at all, so he prefers to solve problems with non-violence. After all, his experience in his previous life told him that no one will be the winner once a fight starts. This is why he will only take action when he has no choice. Growth is a word with a deep meaning. In terms of the body alone, the elves have grown during this period, but do you want to take care of everything yourself? Professor Oak saw Xiu like this and taunted, "Do you have the ability?